Here's a number, $120 billion. That's Amancio Ortega's net worth. If you don't know who that is, that's kind of the point. He's not a household name like Bezos or Musk, even though for about 4 hours in October 2015, he was briefly richer than both of them and richer than Bill Gates too. He built it selling t-shirts and jeans out of a company most people can't name, run from a small town in Spain. Now here's the part that should actually bother you. Every piece of business advice you've ever consumed, every podcast, every How Billionaires Think video, every startup guide has told you the same thing. Stay lean, don't own what you don't have to. Let someone else carry the machinery and the risk. That advice isn't wrong. It's built entire empires. It's the whole doctrine behind asset-light business, the idea that the smartest companies own almost nothing and outsource everything. Ortega did the exact opposite on purpose, and he ended up just as rich. So either one of these two men is wrong, or the rule you've been taught was never actually the rule. Let's find out which. Ortega was born in 1936 in a village in northern Spain so small it barely shows up on a map, a handful of houses along a railway line, right as the Spanish Civil War was starting. His father worked that railway, his mother cleaned other people's houses. There's one memory that people who've studied his life keep coming back to. He was a boy, standing next to his mother at the counter of a local grocery store, while she quietly asked if they could put a little more on the family's tab. The shopkeeper said no. Ortega watched his mother be turned away, right in front of him. He left school not long after 13 or 14, depending on which account you read, and took a job delivering finished shirts for a tailor in the city of A Coruña. Shirts made for wealthy men who never had to think about what they cost. Every day, this kid who had nothing was carrying clothes he could never afford to men who never once considered the price. That contradiction followed him for the next decade, through jobs as a draper's assistant and a tailor's apprentice, jobs that taught him something most people in fashion never bother to learn: exactly how a garment actually gets made, cut, priced, and marked up. Not the design, the mechanics. By 1963, in his mid-20s, Ortega had saved enough to start something of his own. With his family, he began sewing quilted bathrobes under a company called Confecciones Goa. I want you to sit with how unglamorous that is for a second. Not fashion, bathrobes. If you'd met him then, you would have had zero reason to think this was the start of a $100 billion story. But the thing he was actually building wasn't the bathrobes, it was the mechanism underneath them. He controlled every step himself. The fabric, the machines, the pricing, and this is the part that mattered, how fast he could react when something wasn't selling. No factory owner overseas he had to negotiate with, no 6-week wait for a shipment. If something wasn't working, he changed it that week. He married Rosalia Mira in 1966. Together, they kept building, and in 1975, they opened a store. He originally wanted to call it Zorba, after the film Zorba the Greek. The paperwork got rejected. A bar nearby had a similar name already registered, and with the sign half made, they rearranged the letters they had into something close enough: Zara. The idea was almost embarrassingly simple. Take what wealthy people were wearing, the exact kind of clothes Ortega used to deliver as a boy, and get an affordable version onto shelves, while the trend was still a trend, not 6 months after it had already died somewhere else. It worked. Store by store, city by city, through the late 70s and into the 80s. And in 1985, Ortega folded the whole operation, the factories, the stores, everything into a single company, Industria de Diseño Textil, Inditex. By then, without anyone framing it this way yet, he'd built a company that quietly broke the one rule almost every successful modern brand seemed to follow. Quick gut check. When you picture a smart modern business, what do you picture? Probably something asset-light. A brand, a logo, a marketing budget, and a spreadsheet full of contracts with other people who do the actual making. That's not a bad instinct. Plenty of the biggest names in consumer goods built themselves exactly this way. They looked at manufacturing and saw a trap. Fixed costs, fixed factories, fixed locations, capital and attention pulled away from design and brand. So they let it go entirely. Someone else's factory, someone else's machines. They kept only the idea and captured the gap between what something costs to make and what people will pay because of what the brand means to them. That's a brilliant equation. It's also an equation that only works if your product doesn't need to move fast. Nobody buys a specific pair of sneakers because they saw a similar one on a runway 3 weeks ago and need it before the moment passes. The sneaker trend cycle is slow enough that outsourcing the making of it barely costs you anything. Fashion, real fashion, the kind that changes every few weeks, doesn't work that way. And that's exactly the gap Ortega built his entire company around. Here's the part almost nobody explains properly. Ownership isn't good or bad on its own. It's only worth the cost if what you're buying with it is control over the one thing that actually decides whether you win. For an asset-light brand, that thing is usually meaning the story people believe about the logo. Outsourcing everything protects that perfectly, because nothing about a factory on the other side of the world threatens the story a brand tells about itself. For Ortega, that thing was speed. If a style shows up on a runway in Paris on Monday, and it takes 6 months to get a version of it into your stores, you've already lost. The moment is dead before you've sold a single piece. Every one of his competitors at the time was still running on 6-month cycles, built around 2 seasonal collections a year. So he built his own factories, concentrated close to home in Spain and Portugal, his own fabric dyeing operations, and a design team that behaved less like fashion designers and more like a newsroom reacting in real time to what stores were reporting that same week. A new design could go from sketch to shelf in 4 to 5 weeks. A restock of something already selling, as little as 2. He didn't want the factory, he wanted the clock. The factory was just the only way anyone had figured out to buy it. What actually made this work wasn't just owning the factories. Plenty of companies own factories and still move like a glacier. What Ortega built behaved more like a single nervous system than a company. Every store, every day, feeds information back up the chain almost instantly: what's selling, what people are asking for, that isn't even on the racks yet. That signal can turn into an actual product within days, not quarters. Shelves stay deliberately a little empty. Popular pieces get made in small batches and replaced instead of restocked, which created a strange side effect nobody planned for. People started shopping more often, because if they didn't buy it this week, it genuinely might not be there next week. Scarcity, built into the supply chain itself, not manufactured by a marketing team. In 2001, Inditex went public. Ortega became Spain's richest man in a single afternoon. The reporters covering the story that day found him back in the company cafeteria, eating lunch. Here's where I have to be honest with you, because it would be dishonest not to be. In 2011, Brazilian labor investigators raided garment workshops in São Paulo and found migrant workers from Bolivia and Peru in conditions officials described as slave-like, working to fill orders for Zara branded clothing. Inditex's response was almost identical to the defense asset-light companies reach for all the time. This was unauthorized outsourcing by a supplier, not something the company itself had done. Think about how strange that is. The company that built its entire identity, its entire competitive advantage around owning and controlling its own supply chain, still reached for the exact same excuse a company that owns nothing reaches for, the moment something went wrong deep inside that chain. Ownership doesn't automatically mean accountability. Outsourcing doesn't automatically mean exploitation. 2 companies, built in completely opposite ways, ended up in almost the same place the second the cameras showed up. There isn't a single right answer here, and I know that's not a satisfying one. It's not a clean rule you can put on a slide or a t-shirt, but it's the true one. Ortega didn't get rich because he owned factories on its own. He got rich because he figured out, earlier than almost anyone else in his industry, exactly which single variable his customers actually cared about, and then built a company willing to do whatever it took to protect that one thing, no matter how unfashionable the method looked from the outside. For him, that thing was never being the company that made you wait. The boy who once stood beside his mother, being told no at a grocery counter, spent the rest of his life building a company that makes sure nobody ever has to hear that word from him. So stop asking whether you should build lean or build heavy. That was never actually the question. And anyone who tells you there's one right answer is selling you something simpler than the truth. The real question, the one both of these men answered in opposite ways at the same time in the same industry, is this: what's the one thing that actually decides whether the people you're trying to reach choose you over everyone else? And are you willing to structure everything else around protecting it, even if it means doing the exact opposite of what everyone told you was smart? Thanks for sticking with this one all the way through. Stories like this take a long time to actually get right, so if you got something out of it, genuinely helps more than you'd think. Let me know in the comments which side you'd have bet on. And if you want more of these, hit subscribe, there's another one of these coming.